All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Kornbluth. Many of you know me from our practice. We are very happy to have joined with the rest of the larger and growing New York Gastroenterology Association, NYGA group, and we've put this out for everyone to join us. We're going to host this on our website when this is done, and we're probably going to include some additional slides because as we get to the end of the show here, the newest information is about the vaccine, and I think that's what people really are going to want to hear about. I'm going to speak about what we know so far, and literally over the last hour, there's new information that's been coming out. So we're going to talk about what a lot of you already know to be the case, and some information in terms of some scientific background you might be interested in, some very practical information, and what are the newest things in terms of therapeutics, meaning medications to treat the disease versus the vaccine. So just in terms of terminology, we used to talk only about coronavirus, and now you'll hear more about COVID-19. Strictly speaking, the virus, more specifically than coronavirus, is known as SARS-CoV-2. Why do we say that? Because coronavirus, there's 4 coronaviruses that are not involved in these more serious illnesses that we've seen, such as SARS-CoV-1, which was around in 2002 and 2003, led to about 8,000 deaths worldwide, was able to be squashed fairly quickly. Then there was MERS, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which was a fatal disease, also squashed pretty quickly. Those were these epidemic fatal coronaviruses. We've had for many years, one of the most common causes of the common cold are one of 4 different coronaviruses. So we've sort of gotten away about speaking about this as a coronavirus. We've sort of renamed it SARS-CoV-2 because the genome, the genetic makeup of it, is similar to SARS-CoV-1, which was the SARS outbreak started in Asia in 2002, 2003, thankfully short-lived and essentially eradicated. So this looks a lot like that genetically, so it's been called SARS-CoV-2. You rarely hear it called SARS-CoV-2. People originally called it the coronavirus. Now, most people have talked about it as COVID-19, because it was unfortunately discovered December 31st, 2019 was the first case reported in China, and then it rapidly spread, as we all know, around the world. So we're often calling it COVID-19, but strictly speaking, in the medical literature, we refer to the virus as SARS-CoV-2 and the disease as SARS-CoV-2 and the disease as COVID-19. Sort of the way you can think about HIV is the HIV infection, AIDS is the disease. What is it exactly? For those of you who are hearing a lot of terminology thrown around, and I have to start here by saying probably the single best place to get day-to-day news information, and frankly, the best scientific information, because this is, as you know, breaking news literally hourly on many days. Way before it becomes available to us in the medical literature, it's appearing in the best place, I would say, is the New York Times. They have probably, of all the papers, and frankly, I've been reading everything there is to know obsessively since about March 9th. And I tell my patients all the time, first of all, I preface all my comments by saying what we know as of today, November 24th, I believe it is today at 8:10, this is what we know, because it'll often change by tomorrow morning. Things have changed in literally the last hour, as we'll get to in a few minutes. So frankly, the things you'll learn about the quickest is in the New York Times, and the links they have there in their free mobile app. Just type in New York Times Corona app. That is probably the single best place to get all your information. And the links will bring you to everything from a recent study, to an FDA report, to a CDC report, to an interview, to a symposium that was just done at Johns Hopkins, to a Chinese medical journal. I thought, gee, this will be great to read because this is really where the disease started. I went to the Chinese medical journal, and the problem was it was in Chinese. So the New York Times really does the legwork. If you want one other extraordinarily comprehensive site, which is far more academic, but a lot of links to the lay newspapers, is the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center. You could read hours and hours on any imaginable topic, from school openings to prison conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Plus a lot of very good links back to the lay press, in the New York Times, to the academic press. So this is a frequent cause of respiratory infections globally, again, the common cold, and that's maybe one of the reasons kids are thought to not get real sick, because the kids are getting runny noses, sore throats all the time. They're getting sick a lot more with the common cold than we are as adults. They might have that fresh immunity laying around, so when they see the coronavirus, the bad one, they might have immunity to it. So that's one of the theories. Maybe the antibodies cross over. We've seen this again, SARS in 2002 and 2012. Fortunately, those were pretty limited. There was a lot less transmission around the world. SARS-CoV-2 is obviously the one we have now. And again, strictly speaking, COVID-19 is the actual disease. So where have we been and where are we now? And unfortunately, most people who are listening to this, I imagine, are from our practices, which means New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And we've lived through the worst of this. And unfortunately, it's heartbreaking because we have colleagues, us physicians have colleagues we've gone to school with, we go to meetings with, who are around the country now, and they frankly didn't learn the lesson from what we all lived through in March, April, and May. And I get a little choked up because so many of you folks out there know someone who or were sick with the disease, or know someone who was sick with the disease, or God forbid, passed away from this disease, and they just didn't learn from us, up to the doctors, up to the academic center. So where did this start? Looking back, New York City, very dramatic timeline. And I could tell you, all of us in the Mount Sinai orbit, we were intimately involved from day one because this was a New York City disease. That's not to say the suburbs, New York, New Jersey, Rockland County, Orange County weren't deeply involved as well, but New York City was the world's epicenter, March, April, and May. March 1st, this is the history, you might remember, a woman just came back from Iran, turned out to be a healthcare worker. She ended up going to the Mount Sinai ER, sent home. Fortunately, she did well. First case reported in New York City. There had already been cases Washington, Oregon, as you remember. March 2nd, well-known case, an attorney living in New Rochelle would take Metro North into the city every day. Within a couple of weeks, 130 people, 120 people, an extended cluster revolving around a lot of weddings, bar mitzvahs, and funerals that happened in that single community. Unfortunately, that was soon, and fortunately he recovered. That epidemic, that mini cluster, settled down after a couple of weeks. March 10th, this was a major turning point, tipping point in the Jewish communities. Purim, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a very celebratory Jewish holiday. A lot of dancing. But again, this is before it was known that this was such a contagious epidemic disease already here in New York City. Dancing, almost everyone's bringing food gifts to other people. There's a lot of sharing of food. That was the tipping point. Between March 10th and the end of Passover, about 6 weeks later, is where you had this exponential explosion of cases in the Jewish community. The other communities that were so hard hit were the Black and Latino communities, who were affected twice as much as any other community. And if you look around New York City, you can really chart it by the lower financial incomes, and the people who lived in the most crowded housing situations had by far the largest incidences. You could look in the New York Times, even to this day, every day they have a tracking heat map where you can look at the whole country. You could literally slide a cursor over every zip code, and you could look at your own zip code, look at what parts of the city, the state, the country are being worst affected. Peak death rate, April 16th, right around Passover time, we were having 1,000 deaths a day, and we're talking about just New York City. This is not even the state. This is not looking into Rockland County. Horrific. July 1st, by July 1st, in New York City, 1 in 37 people tested had been positive. And as you remember, there were very few tests. So there were far, far, far more people who were positive who had not been tested. And 1 in 360 people living in New York City had died. 1 in 360. If you went to the area that the highest incidence, East New York, almost exclusively African-American, population, median income, this is all from New York Times, really deep reporting, $27,000 annual income. The death rate there was 1 in 170 people in that neighborhood died. 1 in 170 people living there. This is what we lived through. We're all Mount Sinai docs, and this is what it looked like. The reason I put this up is if you look at the triangular buildings that you see at the bottom of the photograph, this is the hospital. There's 3 wings. This is Fifth Avenue running down, excuse me, between these buildings and Central Park. What do I want to point out here? Mount Sinai has about 1,100 beds. They expanded to 1,300 beds, as did Cornell, as did NYU, as did Columbia. Out of 1,100 beds that went to 1,300 beds, 1,000 beds were COVID beds. ICUs were popping up everywhere. ORs, recovery rooms became ICUs. If you look at these windows, you see some of these windows are wood blocks. What those were, if you can't really see through these photos, is they had round black portholes because the inside of those rooms had venting out to the street through these portholes. That is the sort of changes that had to be made. And many of those still remain. And what you see there on the green lawn there, this was very dramatic. I got a lot of press at the time. This is Samaritan's Purse. This is from Billy Graham's family. This is a charitable organization, philanthropic organization. They've gone everywhere from Haiti earthquake to Ebola, and now to the peak of the epidemic in New York City. They came on a Saturday night in March. 3 days later, they had erected these tents. You see here right on the lawn, across the street from Central Park, 300 beds built in 3 days. This was a dramatic contribution by this organization. And you see here at night, you see them lit up here. This was functioning around the clock. Where are we now? Well, we're better, but we're getting worse. This is from yesterday. And again, I could have updated this and not just come back from the hospital for today's data. This is yesterday's data, November 23rd. You see it right here, the cases. Now, one thing to be aware of when you're looking at case counts, the more you test, the more cases you'll find. We'll see far more cases today than last week, than the month before, perhaps. A, there's more availability of testing, and B, more people are coming to their senses and saying, you know what, I might have been in contact, I might have been exposed, or maybe I really should just get tested to know that people around me should be worried about me if I'm infected. So there are a lot more tests. So that is sort of an artificial number, the number of cases. And Trump made a point. He said, you know what, we're having more and more cases because we're having more and more tests available, which is true. But what is not sort of an artifact about how many tests you have available is the percentage positive. That is what we have to worry about. But then you could even say, well, it's more positive because more people are worried about their minor symptoms, so they're getting tested. So maybe that's why it's going up and people really aren't that sick. What you can't fake, what you can't game is the number of deaths. And you could see here, November 23rd compared to a rolling 7-day average of 21%. That number is now 30%. And if you look around the country, it's up to 60%. 60% increased death rate compared to 7 and 14 days earlier. The number, the raw number is much lower than what we saw, but in terms of this exponential growth rate, we are losing again. How about where we live? Our patients, you folks are probably all, or the great majority of you, living here in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. Again, this is as recent as yesterday. In Connecticut, new daily cases. Again, sort of an artifact of how many people are getting tested. 5,000 patients in the day count yesterday. That was up from this week and up compared to last week. Tests per 1,000 people, a measure of test availability, which right now is off the charts, which people are trying to get tested before they go to their families for Thanksgiving. And I'm sure that'll come up during the questions. So how good are we doing? Well, they have almost 10 tests per 1,000 people available. Percent positive. Now that's, again, that's an important parameter. That's not just a function of having tests available. And you could see that there was almost 6% positive And again, that was up this week compared to last week when it was down. That's Connecticut. How about New Jersey, another large number of our patients? Cases are increased this week, increased last week. Not that many tests being done. There should be more tests available. More people should get tested. And the positivity rate, 8%. Up this week, up last week. New York, we're seeing more cases, but obviously we have the largest population. But again, per 1,000 people, we're doing okay. Almost 10 tests per 1,000 people. Up in terms of the number of people who had access to tests. That's good. However, the number of positive, that's where we're having problems. We're bouncing around that 3% number. And as you know, de Blasio and Cuomo are using that as a tipping point to put into account new restrictions. And we could talk about the logic, the rationale of closing schools at 3%, while restaurants and bars might still remain open. But that positivity rate is tipping the corner a little bit. But again, this is just one day's data from yesterday. Okay, so when to suspect an infection and what to do. This is very practical information. Many of you have been hearing this for March, April, May, and on. But I think now we're hearing more about it because we got lulled into a sense of confidence and comfort, because thank God, March, April, May, June passed. Starting in July, things started opening up and things seem to be a lot better. The warm months doesn't mean that the virus disappeared, as some said it would. It basically meant that we had less risky behavior, meaning less indoor crowding, which seems to be the issue now. So now again, we're starting to pay attention and thinking about, am I infected? These are the major symptoms, and you're all familiar with these, I imagine. The four most common: fever, loss of taste or smell, and that's what you don't see in any of the other viral diseases or respiratory tract disease. And this is usually pretty profound. A lot of people say, I feel achy, I feel fatigued. We all feel achy and fatigued by the end of the day. The loss of sense of taste or smell, when it comes on, it's not subtle. From what I hear from my many patients who have been infected, is that comes on. There's nothing else that looks like or feels like that. And that can in fact last for weeks past recovery. It is almost always reversible, but don't take that as a signal that you're still sick and infectious. Dry cough, excuse me, hopefully that's just some allergies. Dry cough, more than a more productive cough. Productive means of sputum. Fatigue is pretty profound. Achiness is pretty profound in many people. And there's a lot of symptoms here. And the CDC continuously listed additional symptoms that we should ask about when you come into the office, when you're coming into restaurants, when you're going to the airport, when you're going to school. But these are the major ones. Fever, obviously an important one. As gastroenterologists, we pay attention, obviously, our patients call us with GI symptoms, and they want to know, is this COVID? Well, it turns out it's pretty uncommon that the only symptom you'll have will be GI symptoms. The most common, and that got lumped together originally when we said 45% of patients had GI symptoms. But in those 45% were people who lost their appetite. The medical word for that is anorexia, loss of appetite. People who just had some cramping. That was lumped into this GI manifestations of COVID. Real pronounced GI symptoms as the primary symptom is pretty uncommon. In our patients, as you know, we have many patients we see with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Diarrhea is a symptom, a hallmark symptom of those diseases, and of COVID-19 is sometimes superimposed. So it's hard for us to sometimes think how much of this is COVID, how much of this might be their underlying Crohn's and colitis. So these are the stages, and this is very important when you think about when is it safe to go out again? Because, and this is as of literally, I think 6:30 or so, there's been a new discussion about how long we should quarantine ourselves. The 14-day quarantine story, excuse me, is based on this. What are the stages of infection? When do you think you're sort of out of the woods, and when are you not? So most people, fortunately, don't even know they have the infection. And that's a problem, because those are the people who are going home. They feel great because they're teens, they're 20s, they're 30s, but they don't realize when they're visiting their grandparents or they're visiting, God forbid, their friend who's getting chemo, they are potentially deadly, in plain English. Most people obviously don't know before they have symptoms. Then within days, let's say 0 to 5 after the infection, fever, dry cough, diarrhea, headache. And then when the people are starting to get into trouble, and these are the people who are calling us, these are the people we worry about, should they go to the hospital? And that's a tough call. You got somebody with COVID who's getting short of breath and needs oxygen. You obviously want him to be in a hospital. If it is the flu or a common cold, the last place in the world you want to be during a peak, and we're hitting upswings again, is to be in a hospital where there's COVID. So this is important to recognize. And really, if you're not really short of breath, if you're not going to need oxygen, we'd like you to stay home. The people get into real trouble, the people are on oxygen and that are starting to crash. This is the problem. You're starting off, as you see here in the bar graph at the top, you start with the viral response. The virus is reproducing and causing local inflammation, typically in the lungs, cough, dry cough, a little shortness of breath, upper respiratory tract. That's due from the local virus. Then you see it go into, say, days 5 to 10, and the people who are getting into trouble, that's called the host inflammatory response. It's not so much the virus doing its damage on its own, it's the virus has triggered this inflammatory storm, and the word for that is cytokine, C-Y-T-O-kine. Cytokines are inflammatory chemicals, and some of these are the same things that cause inflammation in Crohn's and colitis, and we'll get to that in a minute. These people are now being overwhelmed by these cytokines, this inflammatory storm. Those are the people that get overrun in the lungs with lung pneumonias. They get inflammation in the heart, the kidneys, the liver. Those are the people who are in the greatest trouble. Those are the people who end up in ICUs. It's not just the virus anymore. And treating the virus at that point, it's probably too late. That's not when we want to use the antiviral antibiotics. That's when we start using things like steroids to block that immune response. So again, we think about, and we've gotten better at treating people with COVID, fortunately, and more people coming in and leaving the hospital now, and this is being tracked very carefully, than in March and April, because we recognize how to treating them early and which drugs, where they are in their disease course. When should you get tested? Ideally, everybody would get tested. But unfortunately, there aren't enough tests. But if you have symptoms of any of those that I mentioned, even if they're mild, fortunately now we have enough tests mostly. So if you're having symptoms, the symptoms now where we are, there's more and more people infected, they can be infecting you. So even mild symptoms, it does make sense to get tested. The magical number for when you have to worry about having been exposed is within 6 feet for at least 15 minutes. If you've had exposure to someone who's been with you at work and you hear that they have now tested positive and you are hanging out with them, 15 minutes within 6 feet, that's the quote increased risk. If you pass them in the hallway, not so much. If you get asked, as we do, we ask you if you're coming in for a procedure to get tested so you could come to the hospital, so you could come to the endoscopy center. Once you get tested, we'd actually prefer that you stay quarantined. So when you get that negative test, let's say on a Monday, your procedure's on a Thursday, you're not around and about on Tuesday and Wednesday where you might get infected. And that's why you see here, you should self-quarantine or isolate. Those terms are getting to be used interchangeably once you know what your test result is. So here are the terms that you're going to hear, and this is changing all the time. So COVID the test, the most sensitive and maybe too sensitive, and I'll mention in a moment, is the swab that can go for variable distances, okay? One is called the brain biopsy, where you take that, and those of you who have had it, it's really not that bad. I've had them 5 times already, because every time I go visit my 87-year-old mom, which is a huge mitzvah in itself, I do a double mitzvah by putting myself through the nasopharyngeal swab. It's not that bad. It takes about 5 seconds in each nostril. It gets put into a little container of medium, and everything gets shortages. The swabs might be available. The test tubes that have that medium might be on shortage. The labs might have not enough people to run the test. That's called the PCR, sometimes also see as NAAT. Usually you'll see which is nucleic acid amplification test. These are markers for the actual RNA. There's DNA, which is a genetic component, there's RNA. This happens to be, this virus is an RNA virus. That's why we do a PCR for RNA. Nasopharyngeal means going all the way back here. Nasal actually goes about halfway up the nose. There's even throat swabs. And the golden ring was when we can have home tests, and the saliva test might be it, or even throat swabs you could do at home. And in the last couple of days, there's talk about a test that's going to be available at home. The cost is being debated. If everybody could get tested a couple times a week, we could put out this disease far quicker than what we're dealing with now. The rapid antigen test, and this is often, some places it's good enough. For instance, coming to an endoscopy center or the hospital, it's not good enough. The virus has various particles, and this test detects various particles, but not necessarily a live virus. So you could get false positives and you could get false negatives. False negatives means it's not sensitive enough to pick up someone who really has the virus. There's a trade-off. If everybody in the country could get a rapid test 3 times a week, that would be far more valuable than having a more accurate test that only 1 person in 100 could get. So there's a trade-off. Antibody tests, very different. They have no real value in telling you if you are infectious. An antibody for any infection, if you have the disease and then you develop an antibody, you're getting over the disease because your body is producing an antibody against what's called an antigen, the virus in this case being the antigen that triggers your body's immune response to make an antibody. Antibody tests, which are available pretty freely, most labs, it's much easier to get one of those, and it's a blood test, just tells you you were infected. When we first started having antibody tests in about May and June, we were seeing the first wave of people who, thank God, were able to get over the disease. They had antibodies, and we basically told them, we have no idea if these antibodies, A, are protective, and B, for how long they're protective. That's going to be the same question with vaccines we're going to see in a few minutes. We have no idea. What do I think? Well, Mount Sinai has really been at the forefront at looking very carefully at the thousands of patients that came through, collecting data, looking at results to treatment, and really being at the forefront of developing some of the treatments. One of them being the plasma infusions that have antibodies from people who had been sick and then recovered. So when they looked at thousands of people who came through Sinai, 92% of people developed antibodies. And the sicker you were, the more likely you were to make high doses of antibodies. Makes sense. You're sick, lots of virus, your body needs to make more antibodies. And there were certain cutoff points about, is your antibody level enough for you to come and donate plasma to give someone to fight their virus with your antibodies? Some people are now, in my practice, we're seeing it, that people tested positive and now they're negative. So we know they got infected March and April. Now we're in November. Maybe the antibodies last 7 or 8 months. What we haven't seen so far, and hopefully that's telling us that most of these antibodies are present long-term, meaning for 7 or 8 months, let's put it into context, and are present and protective is, we now have over 10 million people just here in the United States, and you might have heard 2 or 3 news reports about reinfections. If this was happening 1% or 1,000%, there'd be hundreds and thousands of cases at this point. We're not hearing it. Reinfection, fortunately, is uncommon. A few hours ago, a paper came out, not a paper, a report, because the scientists will report it to the New York Times in news briefings. We won't see it in a medical journal for weeks to months, that the virus has been mutating. And perhaps in China and then in Europe, and maybe it has been more contagious as a function of mutating. This is data that's just come out a few hours ago. Remains to be seen. We don't know what that means in a practical sense. Who is at greater risk? This translates who you should be staying home away from on Thanksgiving. If you have these relatives and you have not seen them and you're tempted to go spend Thanksgiving because you are close and loving, being close to them might be the worst thing you could do for them. If they are obese, which turns out to be an independent bad risk factor, older patients, have multiple comorbidities, meaning other illnesses, hypertension, diabetes, emphysema, heart disease, liver disease, an elevated CRP, that's a blood test. No one's walking around knowing what their CRP is. And if they were on high doses of steroids of any sort when they got the infection. We'll come to that in a minute. I have just a couple of slides talking about Crohn's and colitis. We're going to do another webinar for our large number of folks we take care of with Crohn's and colitis because there's a number of additional questions. Low dose steroids actually improve things. How could it be prednisone makes you worse and now this makes you better? You heard about this drug that's been around for 60 years, costs penny. It's a steroid called dexamethasone. It's when you give the drug. If you get infected while you're on high doses of steroids, you're massively immunosuppressed. That virus goes wild. Once you get real sick, again, it's because the virus stopped being the real problem. It's triggered this wild inflammatory storm. At that point, you want to treat the inflammation, not so much the infection, the inflammation with steroids. And that's why dexamethasone is effective later in the course of the disease. About Crohn's and colitis, and again, I'm only going to spend a few minutes, although I have a feeling that many folks on this have Crohn's and colitis. Again, I'm going to do a whole additional seminar. Basically, the take-home message here is the following. A lot of data here. Look at the features that impact on outcomes. Crohn's and colitis, first of all, does not increase the risk of getting COVID. People are concerned about it. They say, we know Crohn's and colitis, these are immune-mediated diseases. Maybe have an immune deficiency. In Crohn's and colitis, the problem is your immune system is overactive. It's overactive. So you're not more likely to get an infection because you have an overactive immune system. Then you'll say, gee, I'm on immunosuppressive meds. Will that increase the risk? Anti-TNF drugs, Remicade and Humira being the most common. They don't increase the risk of getting COVID, interestingly enough. And if you do get COVID, the anti-TNF drugs, Remicade and Humira, actually improves outcomes. You're less likely to have a bad outcome because, again, it suppresses that immune system, the immune response in those people who are getting very sick. What are the bad risk factors? If you get COVID, when are you really at risk? And watch out for these people on Thanksgiving. In other words, don't see them on Thanksgiving for their sake. Older patients, people on steroids for other diseases, and people with multiple other illnesses. Greater than 2 illnesses greatly increases the risk of a bad outcome. This was put together by one of our Sinai former fellows, a great new superstar at Sinai, Ronan Garrow, and Brenner at University of North Carolina. It's an international registry. They're up to 3,100 patients, and they've looked very specifically at all the details. These are the things that make things worse. Being on Remicade and Humira, actually, patients did better. So if you have Crohn's, and this is the last thing I'll say again for this talk about Crohn's and colitis, stay on your medication, stay in remission. The bigger risk is you get sick because you stop your meds, except for prednisone. We want to get you off prednisone. That's the worst drug. That's the worst drug. Increases risk of outcomes. I skipped that on the prior scale. Increases the risk of bad outcomes by 8-fold. We want to do everything to keep you well, keep you off steroids. We want to make sure you get vaccinated with non-live vaccines. You don't want this season to get influenza or pneumonia. Why? Because if you got influenza, it's going to, or pneumonia, pneumococcal pneumonia, common kind of bacterial pneumonia. If you got one of those, it's going to feel like you got COVID. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to go outside. We might be in a sort of relative lockdown. We might not have enough flu swabs because we could treat the influenza now with Tamiflu. We might not have enough of those. Everybody's running around getting those. We might not have enough COVID tests for you because that's the other thing we'll be testing for. This is a year you want to sort of exclude that possibility. Get the flu vaccine. Get the flu vaccine. Similarly, if over the age of 65, you're going to get it paid for, get the pneumococcal vaccine. If you're younger or on any immunosuppressive drugs, there too, get the pneumococcal vaccine. This is the time in this window where things are okay. Keep your medical appointments, whether they're telemedicine, video medicine, or in person. Don't let things fall between the cracks. The bigger risk, obviously, in March, April, May, were people going out and potentially getting infected. Now the bigger risk we think of is people falling between the cracks. They got out of the habit of doing their routine follow-up. Monitoring your blood test if you're on our various immunosuppressive drugs, and make sure your infusion center is open and running. We were never closed for a day in March, April, and May. And in fact, the international experts put together a consensus statement that said, this is not the time to run and get your infusions at home. A, you don't know where that nurse has been. B, you're going to lose some continuity. And and we canceled, as you know, 95% of procedures, those procedures that were elective but important, screening for colon cancers, et cetera, make sure they get rescheduled. All right, so this seems so obvious. And in fact, hand washing has sort of fallen by the wayside because people have said, gee, no, it's not so much by touching surfaces, touching our packages from Amazon. It really came down to the infectious disease experts, the epidemiologists. You know what? This is a respiratory illness. This is respiratory borne. It's from droplets. It's from aerosols. What's the difference when you hear those terms? This is, you know, how pathetic my life is. I'm reading aerosol physics papers at 3 a.m. Aerosol particles are smaller than droplets. They're different terms. Aerosols are so light that they're floating around in the air. We don't know for how many hours. We could project a couple of hours. That's why you're in an enclosed space, you're at greater risk. There's more aerosol hanging around. Who expels more aerosol? People like me who talk loud, spit all the time. The louder you talk, the more you expel. There was a massive super spreader event in Utah. 55 people out of 120 people in a choir got sick. If you're going to synagogue, you're going to church, you don't want to be standing next to the guy who's the speaker or reading from the Torah or from the pulpit or the priest who's booming out there. Those are the people, the louder you are, the more likely you are to expel the virus. That's the problem in bars at night. It's close. The windows are closed now. It's getting cold. You're drinking. You get a little too comfortable. You're screaming. It's noisy. That's why the bars and restaurants are thought now to be the common contagion place. Social distancing. Okay, 6 feet away. There's nothing magical about 6 feet, but you got to have some parameter. You got to have some number in your head. Are you better at 15 feet? Probably. There's nothing magical about 6 feet. If you look at this, there's a change in risk with the increasing distance. 1 meter is basically a little bit over 3 feet. So if you look out to 2 meters here on the bottom of this x-axis, you see people at highest risk, this curve in the blue dotted line. Those are people at highest baseline risk for infection. Maybe they have some of those underlying conditions, or maybe they're not wearing their masks and they're hanging around in crowded bars. They're higher risk. They still have risk out at 2 meters at 6 feet, and they still have risk going out to 12 feet, 9 feet. So this is important. There's nothing magical. You have to use logic when applying these rules. This is a mask. I'm going to get agitated. This is not a political statement. I think there are a lot of political views about a lot of things. This has become politicized. People have been humiliated. This became a source of shame to wear a mask. This is horrific. People who got up on soapboxes and talked about how shameful it is to wear a mask, they have blood on their hands. Enough said. A mask saved lives. Is this just talking off the top of our head? And Anthony Fauci, who I consider a national treasure and speaks truth to power, God bless him, very early on he said, and other epidemiologists and infectious disease guys said, masks probably won't do anything. They were talking before we had data. Now we have all this data. Each one of these lines on the left, and you can't see it very clearly, are different studies looking at hundreds and thousands of patients before and after mask mandates, looking at different regions. And this is not just for SARS-CoV-2. This goes back to SARS-CoV-1. This goes back to H1N1. This goes back to MERS. This is something that has been proven time and time again. Now, people say, well, does it pay to wear a paper mask? Does it pay to wear a cloth bandana? Maybe it's not as good as an N95. There's actually studies that say the surgical typical, looking if I have one laying around here, well, I know I do. This is actually an N95, but I don't typically wear this. The surgical paper masks probably work just as well. Why is that? Even though the N95 filters out more and more smaller particles, they're so tight that they find that basically when you're wearing them, you're fidgeting with it so much, you're playing with it, you're putting your hands on it, that you're probably net do just as well with a paper surgical mask. This is actually from all places, Goldman Sachs. They're obviously interested in the effect of public health on the economy. So they did, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, this is from Goldman Sachs Global Investment Research. And they looked from region to region around the country and around the world at mask mandates. And they looked at it because they're interested, decreased illness will lead to greater opening of the economy. So they're very interested when they're making economic projections. States that mandated mask use in the public on a daily county level of rate of growth of COVID-19 confirmed cases before, on the left, before a mask mandate, and you see that number drops time and time and time again wearing the mask. So you say, gee, we talked about getting cases, it's not that important. How about deaths? Masks reduce death. This is the analysis. Cases lead to death. Same analysis before a mask mandate and after. Treatments and vaccines. So this is going to be the final portion of the talk, and actually this is my last slide. And then I'm going to speak quite a bit about the vaccines now without slides because so much has happened the last couple of days. I don't even have the new slide up, but this is where we are. These are available therapies for active infections, and maybe not something you're reading too much about because this is already, once you got the infection and you want to know how to protect yourself against the infection. What do we have? And things have come and gone already, but we have antiviral remdesivir. That's given usually for patients who are hospitalized, who are not so well that they're at home, not so bad that they're already on respirators. Something known as an anti-cytokine, an anti-inflammatory chemical. This is a monoclonal antibody called baricitinib. It's actually being studied in Crohn's and colitis. It blocks certain chemicals that cause inflammation called JAK kinase inhibitors. And for those of you who have Crohn's and colitis, the word JAK kinase or JAKs sounds familiar because we have a drug called Xeljanz, which is like baricitinib, which actually is being studied as well. Human plasma antibody infusion. Mount Sinai put out a call. Within a couple of days, in March and April, 1,000 people showed up in Rockland County, in New City, in New Square, and we had 1,000 people who donated plasma, leading to the first studies of looking at human plasma infusions to treat COVID. And there's mixed results, but it seems to have some benefit. Monoclonal antibodies is another term you'll hear for mild to moderate disease in high-risk patients. You heard about this because this is what President Trump got when he got COVID a few months ago. And in fact, it's reserved really for people who have more severe disease, and people are guessing how severe his disease might have been. This is the two kinds. There's one from Regeneron, there's one from Eli Lilly. What's a monoclonal antibody? The term sounds familiar. If you have Crohn's and colitis, it's because Remicade, Humira, and the other drugs we use, Entyvio, Stelara, they are monoclonal antibodies. Monoclonal means they're raised from a single cell, and then you clone those cells, and there are antibodies against one very specific site. These antibodies tend to go across to what's called the spike protein. And you might have seen pictures of which I had actually on one of the first slides, the coronavirus with all these little spikes coming out. And corona actually means a crown. Those spikes are what latches onto the cells that have receptors for those spikes, and those are called ACE2. Most of the vaccines, many of the vaccines are there so your body will build antibodies to the spike protein, okay? So these are monoclonal antibodies that you give once you already have your own infection with COVID-2 and the spike infection. We don't want to come to that point. That's the point of, and we mentioned dexamethasone. So this is the story on vaccines. And this is what everybody wants to know. And this is now where we are with vaccines. There are now 3 that have completed trials: the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, and the AstraZeneca. And these slides are an evolution, and I'm literally typing up slides up to 5 minutes to 8, and they didn't make it up to this talk. But here's all the information you need to know about vaccines. Vaccines are something we give people, and this goes back to polio vaccine, and before that, A vaccine is there so the body, it could be a live vaccine where we would give you the actual infection and in a low dose, and we hope your body recognizes it, makes enough antibodies and kills it. We have very few live vaccines because we're always worried about you actually getting the illness. And so there's no vaccines that are live. Sometimes you hear the word live attenuated vaccines, where it's a live vaccine that's been weakened a little bit. We don't have any of those. Those aren't in development. What is in development are vaccines that by various mechanisms are there, excuse me for 1 second, that are there for your body to see something that they think is the actual infection, the actual virus. Your body sees something, it says, gee, this is the virus. I'm going to make antibodies to it as if it's the real virus. Then when the virus comes along, you already have these pre-formed antibodies. So let's talk about the ones we have so far. Pfizer, because you'll hear these terms, so at least it will be clear in your head, and I'll have given you a little bit of scientific background today. The two that are now, the first two, Pfizer and Moderna, they happen to be called RNA vaccines. What's given is a portion of RNA, not the entire vaccine, and it's given as an intramuscular injection. This RNA gets into your cells. It's not RNA for the entire SARS-CoV virus. We wouldn't want that to happen, but it is an RNA instructions to construct the spike protein. So your own cells are now hijacked to produce these spike proteins. Spike proteins in themselves aren't connected to the rest of a live virus. It's not going to get you sick. But your body sees these spike proteins now. Your body's made spike proteins. It's a foreign substance. Your body pumps out antibodies to block that spike protein. Now, when the virus comes in with its own spike proteins, your body's developed antibodies against those spike proteins and chews up the virus. Okay, that's the theory. It's the same technology used for Pfizer and Moderna. So when Pfizer came out about 2 weeks ago with their data, in 44,000 patients, half got the vaccine, half got placebo. What's placebo? Basically a salt water injection. They had 2 injections, I believe 3 weeks apart. And that's important when you think about the logistics. When you have 330 million people living in the United States, you now need to have 660 doses. Okay, so we're waiting for instance, J&J has a vaccine, probably going to have data in the next couple of weeks. That's going to be a single dose, which logistically is going to help. Pfizer came out first. They presented their data for analysis to the FDA. As you know, you've been reading about vaccines, for instance, HIV, this horrific disease that was killing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the 80s. We still don't have a vaccine. Vaccines take a long time to produce. How have we been able to produce a vaccine for a disease that was just discovered December 31st? The genome, the genetic code was figured out already by January. Now, 11 months later, we have an effective vaccine. It's unheard of. It's unprecedented. It's almost miraculous. How did it happen? My theory, and I think it makes sense, the world scientists stop and say, this is what we got to be working on. This is what we have to be working on. 2, and this you got to give whoever voted for this a lot of credit, Operation Warp Speed. They have devoted, I think, $9.2 billion to fund research, because doing a study for 40,000 people is not cheap. And B, as importantly, as we'll see, they are paying in advance to these companies to already be producing the vaccine before we had any idea it's going to work, whether it was in phase 1, which is early, phase 2 is earlier, or even the big, what we call pivotal phase 3 trials. They're already cranking out vials. They already are ready to go. And what I read about an hour ago is I believe that Pfizer has 6 million vials or 12 million vials, enough for 6 million people to ship the minute the FDA gives it the green light. They submitted their data about a week ago. I think that the FDA might have an advisory board meeting on December 9th and 10th. Usually, the advisory board means they bring in the country's most expert scientists on virus, on epidemiology, on vaccine development. They sit there, they tell the FDA scientists what their analysis is. The FDA scientists go back to their offices, they look at that data, and because this is such a critical moment in the history of the world, they are going to be doing this in an expedited fashion. And before they even give a formal full approval, they're going to give something, and you'll hear this term, emergency use authorization. They're saying, we haven't done the full analysis we usually do. You submit a new drug application, it could take 6 months to a year for the FDA to give you a ruling. Here, they'll probably give us a ruling in 2 to 3 weeks from the advisory board, maybe even sooner, because they want this out. And they have enough data to say it looks effective and it looks safe. What did the FDA say they want? They want to see 50% effectiveness in people who got the drug, and we want safety data for 2 months on half the people in your study. I want to look at them for 2 months, see what the side effect profile is. But we do know it's truly almost miraculous. It's almost unheard of. And certainly, if you think about influenza infection, the virus we get, it's about 60% effective every year. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, and they use the same RNA technology, 95% effective. 95% effective. If I have the numbers right, of the 9 people who got seriously ill, I believe in the Moderna trial, I might have to be off. Of the 9 people, only 1 person was someone who got a vaccine. So you're looking at, let's say, 15,000 people or so, or if it was the Pfizer trial, 21,000 people, 1 or 2 people got seriously ill. This is a dramatic effectiveness. The trials are somewhat different, so it's somewhat apples and oranges, but we'll take whatever we could get. Some of the studies are looking for people who get sick as a measure of illness. AstraZeneca, for instance, announced yesterday, they were actually testing everybody just to see if they had the virus. So they'll pick up more cases. Pfizer and Moderna, this is we are. Pfizer is the first out of the gate. They'll probably have a ruling by probably end of December. I don't have any secret, unpublished information. And then the drug is ready to roll out of the warehouse that day. That day. Moderna is probably a couple weeks later. What are the logistics of this? The big problem you hear about Pfizer, and that's why we might move right on to Moderna, maybe, we don't know, is Pfizer has to be stored, the vaccine has to be stored at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. When it comes out of that, it only has a couple of days in a routine freezer. So there's a lot of logistics in having centers that can handle millions of doses of vials properly stored. Moderna needs minus 4 degrees. Much easier to handle. AstraZeneca came out with their data literally yesterday. You could store it in a regular refrigerator. The other point, AstraZeneca, they made a commitment. We're going to sell a dose for $4 around the world. They're probably going to be the one that has the greatest ability to distribute the vaccine to people all around the world who are not in the countries as rich as the United States or European countries that can afford to pay for the drug from the pharmaceutical companies. The United States says we are going to provide this drug free to everyone. Free to everyone. They have already contracted with the big pharma companies. The people make the vaccines and have given them contracts and paid them in some cases several $billions to produce the drug in advance, with the deal being if they get approved, they're going to hand the United States that drug. From a practical point of view now, because people say, gee, that's only a few weeks away. I'm ready. So how's it going to be distributed? So this is not going to be something that the mayor in your town is going to decide. This is going to have guidance from the CDC, most likely, not so much the FDA. And then the distribution schemes will be carried out by the states. What seems to be pretty well understood, and I think the CDC literally might have said this today, is, and this has been in all the proposals, is that the first phase 1, the first tier will be healthcare workers. I got to plug in my for 2 reasons. Obviously, number one, we have exposure to a lot of sick people. And number two, if we all get sick and get laid out and disappear, we might not be as much used to you. And sometimes we're not that much used to you anyway, but even less. So healthcare workers and the older patient population. Next, or right along there, people with chronic illnesses. Next, maybe it'll be people, and this applies to a lot of our patients, people who have chronic illnesses but are well. Next, young, healthy people. What's the timeline? Hopefully by the end of December, maybe a week or two earlier, maybe a week or two later, the virus is going to be available to somewhere near you. If you're a healthcare worker, if you're elderly, go and get it. And I'll give you my impression about getting it in a moment. How it's going to be distributed could be huge logistical nightmares, more likely than not. How about the next wave of people eligible? People with perhaps healthy or well-controlled illness, probably the spring. For the 25-year-old healthy people walking down the street, they're thinking maybe summer. We're not going to have enough of the country vaccinated probably till late next year. And I used to tell everybody since March, the guy who's telling you they know when this is going to be over, that's the guy you don't believe. But I can't conceive of that we're going to have what we call herd immunity. Enough of the country is vaccinated before at least fall of next year. And even then, I don't think we're going to be going to Yankee Stadium with 60,000 people or Broadway shows indoors. But certainly there is hope on the horizon. Lastly, the line I heard, and I think I've heard Anthony Fauci say, and I worship the man, it's like Armistice Day. The great powers got together. They say, this is the day we're going to sign the peace treaty. It's 2 days away, and there are soldiers out there still getting killed. That's where we are. The vaccine is here. This is the time to double down. Wear the mask, social distances, don't congregate indoors, wash your hands. We will save lives. Thanksgiving, I'm sure we're going to have some questions. Pete Legnani is going to start putting some questions through. And if that comes up, I'll be happy to address it as well. And whatever questions Peter has, I hope I haven't kept you too long. I probably did. But I'm here. I got nowhere to go. I'm happy to answer questions that you may have. And thanks everyone for your attention. And again, we're going to send out an email about Crohn's and colitis and coronavirus. And this is going to be one in the series. We've really been really delighted, Jim, Pete, Michelle, and I, to have joined New York Gastroenterology Associates. It's really allowed us to do things on a much larger scale. And this is going to be the first in a series of various webinars we're going to provide for our patients. And feel welcome to invite your friends and your family to attend these as well. And the plan is, and hopefully we'll send out another email blast, that within some short time interval from now, we're going to host it on the website as well. If you missed this, you got sick of me and you walked away and you want to come back, it should be available. So that's it. And Peter has been curating the questions. Feel free to submit any questions you like through the Q&A box.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Kornbluth. There's been a number of questions about masks.
Peter, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. There's been a number of questions about masks. Specifically, does it matter the type of mask that you wear, a cloth mask versus a surgical mask? And secondly, the 6 feet distance for 15 minutes, does that matter? And does that apply if you're wearing a mask next to somebody for that amount of time? And does those time periods change?
So these are great questions. And the answer is, they've been put out there as recommendations without clear scientific guidelines. The 6 feet, 15-minute rule, that's not based on a controlled experiment. We put 1,000 people within 6 feet for 15 minutes and other people 15 feet for 10 minutes. These are general guidelines. Wearing a mask, I would assume that means you're still being exposed because no mask is perfect. In terms of that, there have been a bunch of studies now looking at cloth. A single cloth, and it has to do with the fiber density, is probably not as good as a surgical mask, which have been designed to protect infections in the OR, obviously. The best mask to wear is the mask you'll wear. If it's a mask you're going to be constantly fidgeting with because it's not comfortable, you don't want that mask. We'll put on a mask in the morning, you're gonna leave the house, you're gonna go out and be able to wear it all day. If in your own office, the door's closed, no one else is coming in, you take it off. If you're anywhere, and if I wanna walk out of my office right now, I'm sitting in my office and I'm going out into the hallways, I go to the bathroom, there have been people walking around there all day. If I'm in the quote public space in my office, I'm putting a mask on when I walk out. Public areas, we don't know how long those aerosols last. The mask that you wear is the best mask. They say bandanas and cloth are not as effective as the others. I remember when we were scrambling, literally almost buying masks in dark parking lots in March. You get masks anywhere now. Buy masks that are comfortable, buy a bunch of them. I remember we used to rewash masks. Thank God they're available. Wear a mask.
Related question. Does it matter if you're double plying? Do you need to triple ply the mask? Do you need to wear 5 or 6 masks? Does the number of masks that you're wearing increase your protection or not? Very important questions from people.
Yeah, so again, the denser the mask, the better it is. If you're wearing a single, scrawny paper mask that you get, it's not as effective as putting on double masks. So this comes up and not as good as a KN95. What do we know about those masks? KN95s and N95. Those have been designated. I could tell you the size micron particles that will get through an N95, and N95 will block smaller and smaller particles than a KN95, and maybe a surgical mask, and maybe a cloth mask. And there are people who look at this in the lab, blowing different size aerosols through these. The cloth and the bandana is not as good as the legitimate surgical mask. If you can't get your hands on a good mask, double masking makes more sense. People are asking me now about traveling. If you could get your hands on, and we could talk about whether that's a worthwhile endeavor right now. But if you're traveling, especially on a long flight, the more time, the more exposure. I would try and get an N95, even though there's no science that wearing a face shield gives you any protection very much for yourself. It actually protects you from spitting on other people. I would put that on purely because when you got this big plastic shield in front of you, you're less likely to be poking around your face. It makes you aware of that. I also tell people wear gloves if you're on a plane or you're in a gym. Why? Your gloves are still picking up as much filth as your own hand. But wearing gloves, when I was in gym once and I stopped going, is I'm more aware of, I got gloves on my hand, it makes me more aware of my hands that I'm not poking my face all the time. Keeping your hands away from your face is an important thing. You're on a plane, a double mask, I'd try and get an N95, I'd wear a face shield if you can, I'd put gloves on, purely to keep yourself self-aware.
Another mask-related vaccine tie-in. When we get the vaccine, do we still have to wear a mask?
Yes, yes, and yes. When's that green light gonna come on? You'll hear about it. Let me explain the concept of herd immunity, which has been, in some cases, criminally interpreted. Herd immunity, and this is an epidemiology term, herd, H-E-R-D, not like something you're a herd, like a herd of cows. If you have enough people in a population who have been infected and have developed antibodies, there are fewer and fewer people out there who are prone to get infected. So the pool of people who can get infected and infect others shrinks and shrinks. Epidemiologists will debate what percentage of the population need to have immunity, whether it's by getting their own infection or being vaccinated, a much better way to get immunity. At least 60% seems to be the number. So by the time we hit 60%, and right now in the country, there's different speculation how many people might have their own antibodies. It's probably not more than 10% across the country. So it's a long way to go to 60%. What will hopefully get us there is not more people getting infected, as some criminal politicians and one scientist saying, this is what we should shoot for. Let's get everybody sick, and then we'll end the epidemic. No, people get sick, people are gonna die. You get herd immunity by vaccines. When we have enough herd immunity and the coast is clear, people will be shouting from the rooftop. But just because you got the vaccine, emphatically, you cannot stop wearing a mask because you still are prone. We don't know yet if those vaccines that are 95% effective are protective for those 2 weeks of the study, when people, that's how long they were followed to see if they got infected, or for 2 months or 2 years. The flu vaccine tends to last almost a year. That's why we get it every year. Measles, mumps, and rubella, usually for a lifetime. We don't know how effective this vaccine is going to be. So you don't know if you get the vaccine today, you're running around tomorrow, you could get reinfected, or if in your case, you were the 5% in whom it was not effective. So it's not, got my vaccine, toss my mask.
The other important point with that is the more people who wear masks, the more it is in everybody's mind that they need to continue to wear masks. The less people wearing masks, people will start to lose interest in wearing masks. It really is a self-fulfilling cycle. The mask wearing is so, so, so important. Another question. I was exposed to somebody at, name your place, place of worship, Thanksgiving, etc. When should I go to get tested to maximize the likelihood of having a true positive or true negative result?
That's a great question. And, you know, a lot of this, you know, it's such a moving target. I mean, New York now, if you're coming from outside, you know, you're told you got to get tested within 3 days of coming here, and then tested 3 days after getting here and being quarantined in the interim. Again, you might, first of all, there's no test that's 100% true positive that won't have some false negative. That you might be infected, test come back negative. The most accurate are the PCRs, the nasal swabs. The bottom line is you can have a false negative with the PCR. You're less likely to have a false negative, and you're least infected right after an exposure. You might still be positive out to day 5. So I would want to get it within those 5 days. If someone sneezed on you an hour ago, getting it now, you might not have had enough virus replicate to have a positive test. So it should be within the first 5 days. Beyond 5 days, it starts to already decrease. What's interesting, and I read literally at 6:45, is the CDC is saying, you know what, we're going to do away with this 14-day quarantine recommendation. Because you know what, people are just not going to buy into it. Maybe if we say 7 to 10 days, more, 14 days, people just say, forget it, I'm not doing any of it. I'm going to come in from a hot spot, come to New York. Cuomo says I need 14 days. I'm not going to say 14 days, I'm just going to blow it off. If you say 7 days, it sounds more manageable. So they're going to shorten that quarantine period to make it more practical. Again, a lot of this is just sort of trying to make things that make sense and that we can abide by.
Another question. I'm supposed to have a procedure in the next month. Should I postpone that procedure until the summertime when the caseloads are lower and the virus is less infective?
So that's a great question. So if this is a purely elective procedure, and New York right now, and you know, next week it might be more than this week, purely elective. Let's say you get a colonoscopy every 3 years or 5 years, or you had a polyp and it's time to come back in December, you got the reminder, and you're low risk, you never had a cancerous polyp, and you want to wait for a few months, that makes a lot of sense. The risk is, though, you're going to fall out of your routine. You know, every December you get your surveillance colonoscopy with ulcerative colitis, or you get your polyp test, and especially at the end of the year, you got a deductible that you met. You want to get your colonoscopy every 5 years, you do it in December. The risk is, even though you're not going to fall off get a high likelihood of a problem between December and let's say June, the risk is you're going to forget to do it, or other things are going to intervene. Now, right now, we're still sort of in a window, and I like to tell people that in Carnegie Hill or New York Gastro sites for endoscopy, I consider them one of the safest places to be in the city. Everybody gets tested within 5 days of coming in. The waiting rooms are empty. People are discharged quickly. Right now, thank God, we have not seen infections of people who have come and gotten infected. And we've both of our endoscopy centers have now done probably several thousand cases since we're fully at full capacity now.
Just a reminder to everybody, a recording of this will be posted on the website in the near future. So if you want to go back to listen to some of this, there's been a lot of really fantastic points within this, you can get that. That link will be sent out to everybody in the future. Another really great question, I think it's really heartwarming to see this. How do we make people who have already had the virus and have antibodies, how do we convince them to continue to wear a mask? And should we even go through that exercise with them?
Short answer is absolutely, because I can't tell you that tomorrow is when we're going to start seeing reinfections. You can't get sloppy. You can't get sloppy. Remember, you might get reinfected. And I made a good point, a strong point that we're not seeing reinfections. But reinfections means you've gotten sick enough to come to medical attention. We don't know that there are people with antibodies whose antibodies have disappeared and you're not getting antibody tests every month, and you still got some virus hanging around. Maybe not enough to make you sick because you have some antibodies, but maybe you're still able to transmit virus. And you're not worried about transmitting it to your 19-year-old buddy who you just went out drinking with, but you got to worry about going to your bubby's house or grandma's house for Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah, and you're going to get them sick. We're terrified of all these kids coming back from the colleges where some places have a 15 or 20% positivity, and they're coming home, they haven't been tested, they're not quarantining, and they're going to get the family infected. That is the huge fear, and you're hearing it being shouted from the rooftops. And I'll go on my Thanksgiving spiel right now. It's taken on so much drama. For those of us who observed Passover or Easter, we went through this and we didn't make a lot of noise about it. And that's because we were so terrified at that point in time that we said, okay, this Passover, this Seder, we'll sit by ourselves. This Easter, we won't go to church. Don't think that we're out of the woods now, Thanksgiving. If Thanksgiving looked like the way we were in August, maybe. We are in a different time. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, we're in a lot better shape than the Midwest, but we are not safe right now. Things are going up. The huge fear is you're going to get this cross-pollination from areas where there's a much higher incidence, and we're going to get these little pockets of infection, and we're going to disperse after Thanksgiving. That's the big concern. Having an antibody does not mean you are free to get reinfected yourself or to infect others. That's a myth.
There was a number of questions about that with both college students and also people who have children in school, that their kids are exposing them or their loved one who may be an at-risk person to the virus. What can we tell people who have children at school and who have either themselves or family members who are at risk? How should they handle their day-to-day activities? As one person said, they can't just stop living. So how should they go about incorporating their daily life within that?
All right, so the whole issue about schools has been a very hot topic. It's a political hot potato. And I have to say that if you think about it scientifically, what just happened in New York does not make the most scientific sense. In that, fortunately, and we saw this in the worst of this, that very few children were getting sick. There was a small window where there was this very serious immune reaction called multiple system immunologic reaction, where kids got very sick. And I thought, boy, this is going to take off around the country the way SARS did. And it basically stopped after about 150, 160 cases. I don't understand why. But all throughout, we weren't seeing kids. Thank God we weren't seeing pediatric wards filled with kids. Kids have not been getting sick. There's good data that kids under the age of about 8, 9, 10 are less likely to get sick and are a lot less likely to reinfect others. And in schools, where they have been doing periodic testing, the case test, and you saw the positivity in New York hovering about 3%. In schools, the kids were 0.17. 0.17. The kids, and these are in schools, these are probably highly motivated kids and schools, are not coming home infected. To close the schools and the dramatic negative impact it has on the kids and on the families who now have to stay home for these kids is horrible. Yet we are still keeping bars and restaurants open and saying you got to close by 10, as if the virus stops being a problem, becomes a problem at 10:01. The problem is you're in enclosed spaces, you're in each other's faces, you're not wearing masks while you eat or you talk. It made no sense to me. And there's a lot of pushback about that. And in Europe, a lot of the countries that went on re-lockdown, hardcore re-lockdown, France, Italy, Belgium, Spain, even England, who has a prime minister that's more to the right of our own, they locked down, but they said, we're going to keep schools open. That was their sort of compromise. We have to keep society functioning. They kept the schools open and they closed, quote, non-essential businesses. As much as we all like going to restaurants and bars, they are not essential. Our heart bleeds for these poor guys who took their whole life to build up a bar and a restaurant and it's gone. But we can't risk infecting our parents and our grandparents who are getting sick. And I just got off the phone with my kid who's working in a hospital across town. And at Sinai, we went from 6 cases 6 weeks ago, we're up to 200 cases now. It's coming back. It's coming back. And thankfully, it's not the kids. It's now the younger people are not coming to the hospital as much as they were March and April. It tends to be the sicker patients. But the sicker people, the older people, are probably getting sicker from the younger people.
In that vein of still living and people getting back and forth to work and to school, people have been taking subways and buses and wearing their masks on the subway and bus. How many days in a row can you wear your mask, whether it's an N95, a KN95, a surgical mask? How many days in a row can you wear that? And what should you do with that mask to try to prolong its useful life?
The short answer is I don't want to, make believe I have answers to all the questions. I could tell you that, frankly, if the mask is intact, probably more than a couple of days. And the higher grade the mask, the more likely it is to work. The nice thing about the cloth and the bandanas, that although they might not be as effective, again, something you wear is going to be much more effective than something you don't wear. Double masking helps. I can't tell you on any given mask what the lifespan is on that. I could tell you it was this huge scandal that in March and April that doctors were told to turn in their masks and they would only get a mask once a week and then they were going to get rewashed. But it turned out that worked. Right now, thankfully, the masks are out everywhere. You don't have to get bootleg masks. It was crazy what you used to see on Amazon back in March and April. Masks are plentiful. They're high quality. I can't tell you which brands are better than others. Again, the newer, the more high grade the mask, probably the better.
And one final question, and we'll wrap it up here, about vaccines. Where will people go to get vaccines? And will it be given in doctor's offices or only through the state or through CVS? What will that process look like? What do you expect it to look like?
Okay, so this is the sort of thing that I could only tell you what I read about. I tell people I haven't gone to sleep before 2:30. Last night, 4:30, because I was still putting this slide deck together. You'll read this in the New York Times and know before it's announced in any government release. It's not going to be given, to my understanding, you won't get it in doctors' offices. These are going to be highly regulated. Part of the problem is going to be is how much feedback the government wants. You go into CVS or Walgreens, you get a shot, you walk out the door. Here they're going to want to be collecting demographic information. It's going to gum up the works. It's going to slow this down. They want to make sure people went in. They want to make sure people came back for their second vaccine. I believe that I read that the government is contracted with CVS and I think Walgreens that they could be distribution centers. I doubt doctors' offices are going to be part of that first tier of places that'll have it. The logistics remain to be worked out. It's going to be, again, you're looking at even the first week is going to be enough for 6 million people to show up to get vaccinated. So this is going to be a big logistical project, and basically just stay tuned. And you'll hear, this is another point that I want to make before we wrap up. And I thank everyone for hanging out. And I could see how many people logged on to start, and almost everyone's still on the call. There is going to be, and it's our job as physicians, and everyone who logged on tonight, I believe, is probably is interested enough to be paying attention and to be well informed. There are going to be the anti-vaxxers to this vaccine, and people are going to lose lives because of misinformation. We are in an era of conspiracy theory, like for breakfast. We have to maintain vigilance to look at the data, look at the science, and make sense of that. That doesn't work. There are things that won't work. People might get sick from the vaccine, but we can't have these crackpot theories and conspiracies. There was just recently, there was a vaccine, I don't think it was for SARS-CoV-2, I believe it was in Hong Kong. I just read this in the last day or two, where that 1,100 people over the age of 65 die after the vaccine. And there was this huge scandal. This vaccine is poison, it's murderous. It turns out, if you do the statistics, if you took 1,100 65-year-olds over the following week, if you look at enough people, 1,100 65-year-olds are going to die whether they got the vaccine or not. We need to look at this data carefully. We can't look at wild crackpot conspiracy. People will die if you're buying into unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. it's important to stay focused on the real information out there.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to wrap it up with that. Once again, thank you everybody for your attention in attending this. This will be the first of multiple different ones that we'll publicize through this. On behalf of everybody at NIGA, and I know for myself and Dr. Kornbluth, we hope you have a great night and a very safe and happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.